There was a time when I believed that the deepest changes in a person always arrived with noise. I imagined transformation as something impossible to ignore, a conversation that shattered certainty, a farewell that divided life into everything before it and everything after, a single moment so unmistakable that memory could never smooth its edges. I trusted that version of change because it was visible. It left evidence behind. It gave you something to point toward and say, that was the day everything became different. I don't believe that anymore. Life has acquired a way of rewriting us. The most permanent transformations don't announce themselves. They don't arrive demanding attention or asking to be understood. Instead, they settle into ordinary days with such patience that you hardly notice them at all. They become part of your routine before you realize they've become part of you. And one morning, without warning, you discover that you're looking at the same world through entirely different eyes. The strange thing is that you rarely notice where it begins. You only notice the moment you realize you can no longer return to the person you used to be. That's where I find myself now, not standing at the beginning of something, and not yet standing at the end. Somewhere in between, where certainty hasn't fully arrived, yet denial has quietly become impossible. I've looked back more times than I'd like to admit. Not because I was searching for answers, but because I wanted a beginning. A single point I could return to and say, that's where everything shifted. But every time I searched, the trail disappeared. There wasn't one conversation that changed everything. There wasn't one sentence that rearranged my thinking. There wasn't one unforgettable moment demanding to be remembered forever. There were only ordinary moments. Moments so small that anyone watching from the outside would have missed them completely. A pause that lasted just a little longer than expected. A silence that somehow carried more meaning than an entire conversation. The quiet feeling that something had already been understood before either of us tried to explain it. None of those moments looked extraordinary. Yet together, they built something neither of us announced, something neither of us chased. Something that simply continued existing without asking permission to matter. For most of my life, I believed understanding came from information. The more you learned about someone, the closer you became. Questions created familiarity. Time created trust. Shared experiences created connection. It was logical, predictable, comforting, until I encountered something that ignored every one of those rules. Because somehow, without knowing every detail, without sharing years of memories, without walking through every chapter together, there was still recognition. Not the recognition of facts, the recognition of perspective. And those are not the same thing. Facts tell you who someone has been. Perspective quietly reveals how someone experiences existence itself. One can be memorized. The other can only be felt. That's what unsettled me, not because it seemed impossible, but because it felt strangely familiar, as though some forgotten part of my mind recognized a language it had always known, not spoken language, something older than words, the language of observation, of restraint, of noticing what everyone else walks past. Most people hurry toward conclusions. They gather a few details, complete the rest of the story inside their own minds, and rarely wait long enough to discover whether the story they created was ever true. I've done it too, maybe not as often, maybe not as carelessly. But enough to understand how easily assumption disguises itself as understanding. You never seemed interested in assumptions. You never rushed towards certainty. You stayed with uncertainty long enough for something real to emerge from it. That's rare. Most people avoid uncertainty because it offers no immediate reward. It asks for patience, attention, and humility, qualities that have become increasingly uncommon. Yet you treated uncertainty almost like a place worth visiting, not because you enjoyed confusion, but because you understood that clarity arriving too quickly usually sacrifices accuracy. That stayed with me. Not as admiration, as recognition. Because I've always believed that the strongest truths reveal themselves slowly. If something demands immediate acceptance, I've learned to question it. Real understanding never forces itself forward. It waits. Sometimes far longer than we are comfortable with. Maybe that's why this feels different. Nothing about it ever demanded belief. Nothing insisted on being acknowledged. It simply continued existing until ignoring it required more effort than accepting it. And I've begun wondering whether that's how every meaningful thing begins, not through certainty. Through quiet persistence. The sunrise never argues with the night. It simply returns every morning until darkness steps aside without resistance. Perhaps truth behaves the same way. Perhaps connection does too. Lately, I've become increasingly aware of how much of life depends on what remains unspoken, not secrets. Not hidden intentions, something far more subtle, the invisible agreements people make without ever realizing they've made them. The decision to remain gentle when someone becomes vulnerable, the choice to listen without silently preparing a reply. The quiet understanding that not every silence needs to be rescued. These moments rarely receive applause, they're almost never remembered, yet somehow, they become the foundation beneath everything else, and lately, I've found myself paying far more attention to foundations than appearances. Not because foundations are exciting, because they're honest. Anyone can decorate a structure. Very few people stop to ask whether the ground beneath it can actually carry the weight. I've watched conversations collapse beneath beautiful words because there was no real understanding underneath them. And I've watched relationships survive impossible circumstances for one simple reason: their foundation remained intact. That changed the way I evaluate everything, not by appearance, by endurance. Can it remain true after emotion settles? Can it survive misunderstanding? Can it exist without constant reassurance? Those questions matter to me far more than they once did, because permanence isn't created by intensity, it's created by consistency. Anything can feel extraordinary for a moment. Very few things remain quietly true over time. That's what I've been observing, not excitement, consistency. The strange way certain thoughts continue returning, not because I'm forcing them back, but because they never truly left. Like a river that keeps finding the same path no matter how many seasons pass above it. At first, I resisted noticing, not because I was afraid, because I value precision. I've never trusted conclusions that arrive before evidence deserves them. I've seen too many people mistake possibility for certainty, and I promised myself I never would. So I watched carefully, patiently, almost clinically, expecting time to expose whatever illusion had created the impression in the first place. Instead, time did something I never expected. It didn't weaken what I was observing, it refined it. The unnecessary parts disappeared, assumptions slowly dissolved, projections quietly fell away. What remained wasn't stronger because emotion made it stronger. It was stronger because it became clearer, and clarity carries a weight emotion can never imitate. It doesn't demand belief. It simply leaves fewer reasons to doubt. That's the point where observation becomes responsibility. Because once you've seen something honestly, pretending not to see it becomes a decision, and every decision quietly reshapes the person making it. Maybe that was the truth I had been avoiding, not the recognition itself, the responsibility that always follows recognition, because every genuine realization asks something in return. Not immediately, not dramatically, it simply waits, until you're finally ready to answer. Lately I've started wondering whether that answer has been forming inside me much longer than I realized. I keep asking myself whether awareness has a limit. Whether there comes a point where you've understood enough to stop looking deeper. For most things, perhaps there is. You learn the pattern, you understand the behavior, you reach a conclusion, life moves on. But every now and then, something refuses to be completed, not because it's confusing. Because every time you believe you've reached the center, another layer quietly reveals itself. That's what this has become, not a mystery, a landscape. From one angle it seems simple, from another, it becomes almost impossible to describe. I've noticed how often people confuse familiarity with depth. They spend enough time around someone and assume they know them completely. But time doesn't always create understanding. Sometimes it only creates routine. You learn someone's habits, their favorite words, the rhythm of their days. Yet none of that guarantees you've ever truly seen them. I've met people who shared decades together while remaining strangers beneath the surface. And I've witnessed rare moments where recognition arrived long before history had the chance to introduce itself. That realization unsettled me, because it challenged something I had always believed. I thought depth had to be earned through time. Now I wonder if time simply gives us opportunities to notice what was already there. Maybe recognition isn't something we create. Maybe it's something we uncover, slowly, patiently, layer after layer. Like brushing dust from an old mirror until it finally reflects what had been waiting beneath it all along. Mirrors never invent. They reveal, sometimes gently, sometimes painfully, but always honestly. Perhaps that's why another person's perspective can feel so transformative. Not because it changes who you are, because it illuminates parts of yourself you've never stood close enough to see. It isn't transformation, it's revelation, and revelation has a remarkable quality. It doesn't force growth. It simply makes remaining unchanged feel increasingly unnatural. I've noticed small shifts inside myself. Not dramatic changes, quiet recalibrations, the way I pause before reaching conclusions, the way I listen longer than I once did, the way curiosity now feels more valuable than certainty. None of those changes happened all at once. They arrive the way seasons do, quietly enough that no single day feels different. Until one day you look around and realize the entire landscape has changed. I've stopped admiring certainty the way I once did. Sometimes certainty is simply a comfortable place where questions come to an end. Real understanding feels different. It stays open. It leaves room to be corrected. It isn't afraid to discover it was incomplete yesterday. There's a quieter strength in that, one that never needs to announce itself. I've also begun noticing how often people protect their conclusions instead of protecting the truth. When new understanding threatens an old belief, many reject the understanding rather than re-examining the belief. It's understandable. Changing your mind can feel like losing part of yourself. But perhaps the opposite is true. Perhaps refusing to change is what slowly separates us from the person we are capable of becoming. Growth has never asked us to become someone else. It asks us to become more honest about who we've been all along. And honesty, I've realized, has very little to do with words. It begins long before language. It begins in quiet observation, in patient attention, in the willingness to let reality reveal itself instead of forcing it into conclusions it hasn't earned. Maybe that's why silence has become so meaningful to me. Not because silence contains all the answers, because when the noise finally disappears, whatever remains deserves to be heard. And perhaps that's the realization I've been moving toward from the very beginning. Not that I've become someone different, but that I've finally encountered a way of seeing the world that made becoming more honest feel inevitable. Because the deepest changes rarely arrive with noise, they arrive quietly, until one day you realize they were shaping you all along.